Junior Rangers.
Hi, Junior Rangers.
Ranger Nikki here with Ranger What's.
We're here today to read you a story we wrote. It's called The Adventures of Critterville, A Christmas Past, and a story we wrote. We wanted to kind of give it to you as a gift. You'll be the first to hear it, so
yeah.
Well, here you go. Hope you enjoy it.
Yes. Okay.
Keep in mind it's a rope draft, so just follow along. I hope you enjoy it.
Okay. This story of the Adventures of Critterville begins a week before Christmas, the last day of school in Critterville. It was the day of the Critterville Christmas party, and just before the children left school for Christmas vacation, the school teacher, Mr. Edison, gave the children some homework for them to do over Christmas vacation. The homework assignment was to not just think of the gifts they would get for Christmas, but to give thought of a gift they could give to someone without buying anything. This, at first, would turn out to be a harder assignment than the children thought. All the children left school for Christmas vacation giving thought of how to give a gift to another without buying a gift, as the other children all ran out of school to go play.
Alright. Except a black bear named Stanley Berry and his friend, another black bear named Cole Blackstone. With the thought of their Christmas vacation homework assignment on their minds, both went straight to Cole's house where she lived with her uncle, Reverend Blackstone. Once Cole and Stanley got inside Cole's home, they sat down at the table with a glass of milk and cookies and got a pen and paper, began to come up with ideas for the Christmas vacation homework assignment that Mr. Edison had given them. As they drank their milk and ate their cookies, Cole and Stanley would come up with good ideas, but as they gave the ideas some thought, figured out that most of the ideas would require them to buy something to complete the gift for another. After an hour had passed, Cole's uncle, Reverend Blackstone, entered his home only to find Cole and Stanley sitting at the table looking a bit upset.
Okay. Reverend Blackstone smiled as he said hello and pulled up a chair to sit down at the table with Cole and Stanley. As Reverend Blackstone poured himself, Cole, and Stanley a fresh glass of milk and put out more cookies, he asked, "What has you two looking so upset?" Cole and Stanley told Reverend Blackstone about the homework assignment that Mr. Edison had given them for Christmas vacation. After learning that Mr. Edison assigned the children of Critterville to give a gift to someone other than themselves without buying a gift, Reverend Blackstone, with a big smile, took the paper Cole and Stanley were using to write ideas down and said the best way to do the assignment was to go out into Critterville, and they would find the answer out there.
With big smiles on their faces, both Stanley and Cole said, "You're right," as they gave Reverend Blackstone a big warm hug and ran out the door. Cole and Stanley thought maybe someone needs a Christmas tree, and after asking everyone, found out that everyone had a tree, a Christmas tree. After a few more ideas, but not having success, Cole and Stanley, once again, a bit sad, decided to go see Ranger Woods. Once at Ranger Woods' cabin, they saw Ranger Woods carrying a bunch of stuff out. As he dropped some of it, Cole and Stanley quickly ran to help Ranger Woods carry what was in the bag. What was in the bags? It was bags of food and other supplies. When Cole and Stanley picked up the bags that Ranger Woods dropped, it had the name Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls written on the bag. Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. When Cole and Stanley saw the name Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls on the bag, they became puzzled because they didn't know anyone in Critterville named Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. Want to try?
Okay. Ranger Woods thanked Cole and Stanley for helping him with the bags for Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. Cole asked Ranger Woods, "Who is Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls?" Stanley added, "Yeah, Ranger Woods, we don't know anyone in Critterville named Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls." Ranger Woods, with a smile, and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls are an old couple who live just outside of Critterville, and if you would like to meet them, help me take these bags of groceries to them and I will introduce you to them." Both Cole and Stanley smiled and happily agreed to help Ranger Woods to take the bags to Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. Cole and Stanley both grabbed a couple of bags each and followed Ranger Woods across Critterville into the woods just outside of Critterville.
Alright. After a few short moments of walking through the woods, they arrived at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. Cole and Stanley were both surprised that Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls lived so close to Critterville, yet never knew or met Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. Ranger Woods knocked on the door, and a few seconds later, an elderly old rabbit answered the door. Mrs. Ingalls greeted Ranger Woods, Cole, and Stanley with a hello and Merry Christmas. Ranger Woods, Cole, and Stanley all said Merry Christmas back. Miss Ingalls smiled as she saw two children standing, Cole and Stanley, and invited the two children, and Mr. and Ranger Woods inside the home for a cup of hot chocolate. Once inside, Cole and Stanley noticed all the beautiful homemade Christmas cookies as well as all the Christmas decorations.
Okay. As Ranger Woods, Cole, and Stanley drank their hot chocolate and ate cookies and talked with Mrs. Ingalls about school in Critterville, Mr. Ingalls finally appeared as he rolled into the room in his wheelchair. Mrs. Ingalls, had mentioned before in the conversation that her and Mr. Ingalls never got to Critterville, and after seeing Mr. Ingalls in a wheelchair, they now understood why. Mr. Ingalls was a happy, cheerful man who loved his wife, Christmas, and to write stories. As everyone sat drinking their hot chocolate, Mr. Ingalls read one of his stories to them. Once he had finished, everyone clapped, with Cole and Stanley hugging Mr. Ingalls for reading them one of his many great stories he had written. As the children hugged Mr. Ingalls, a big smile and tears of joy filled Mr. Ingalls' happy face.
Ranger Woods, Cole, and Stanley all thanked Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls for the hot chocolate, the Christmas cookies, and the great story Mr. Ingalls wrote. Once back in Critterville, Cole and Stanley got back to the task of doing the homework assignment given to them by Mr. Esmond. So they spent the rest of the day trying to figure out how to give a Christmas gift to someone without buying them a gift. And by the end of the day was once again sad as they could not figure out what to do to complete the homework assignment. Once again, at the table, with a glass of milk, once again, Reverend Blackstone sat down at the table as he saw the sad looks on Cole and Stanley's faces.
Reverend Blackstone asked, "How is your homework assignment coming along?" With a sad face, Cole answered, "Still working on it." Stanley added, "Yeah, not a clue what to do." Reverend Blackstone, with a smile, knowing they had visited Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls, said, "Give thought of all you did today and all you met today, and I think you may find the answer to your Christmas gift there. With a big smile, Reverend Blackstone poured Cole and Stanley another glass of milk, and left so they could give thought of the things they had done and the folks they had met throughout the day. With that, Cole and Stanley both yelled, "I got it!" Then they looked at each other, laughing, and both yelled, "We got it!"
Cole and Stanley grabbed some paper and pencil to write down ideas to come up with a Christmas gift for Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls that could not be bought. After much thinking and writing, Cole and Stanley had a plan on a Christmas gift that they could give Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. They decided, because Mr. Ingalls was in a wheelchair and they lived just outside of Critterville in the woods, that Mr. Ingalls was unable to come to Critterville because his wheelchair would need a smooth path for him to be able to come to Critterville, with hopes he would also come to the school once a week and read to the children of Critterville with the great stories he wrote.
At the top of the page, Cole wrote, "We will call it the Ingalls Christmas Path," as Stanley agreed. They knew they would need lots of help and asked all the children of Critterville for their help, and all were happy to help create the Ingalls Christmas Path. So for the next week, while keeping it a secret from Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls, the children of Critterville cleaned brush, weeds, tree limbs, hauled stones up from Yellowstone Creek to create a flat stone path from Critterville to Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls' home. Along with a flat stone path, the children took the dead tree limbs and created an archway over the path to help keep the snow, tree limbs, and other things off the Ingalls Christmas path, allowing Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls to easily travel to and from their home to Critterville freely.
The children worked hard all week long, all the way up to Christmas Eve day. The Ingalls Christmas path was complete except for a few small bushes that stood between Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls' home and the Ingalls Christmas path, allowing the children to keep it a secret from Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. The children borrowed, what's it? Right here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. Allowing the children, along with all the folks in Critterville, to string Christmas lights along the way, all the way through the archway above the path. Once complete, the children, along with all the folks from Critterville, waited in the Ingalls Christmas path behind the bushes between the Ingalls home and the Ingalls Christmas path.
Okay. Ranger Woods, along with Cole and Stanley, knocked on Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls' front door. After a few seconds, Mrs. Ingalls, wearing her warm and wonderful smile, opened the door and excitedly said, "Hello," said Merry Christmas and hello, as her and Mr. Ingalls rarely get many visitors to their home. Ranger Woods, Cole, and Stanley, all with big smiles on their faces, said hello and Merry Christmas back to Mrs. Ingalls. Cole asked Mrs. Ingalls, "Could you and Mr. Ingalls please come outside for a Christmas gift the folks of Critterville wished to give them?" After a few minutes of getting their coats on, Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls came out their door, and as they did, Ranger Woods and the folks of Critterville removed the bushes concealing the Ingalls Christmas path. And as the bushes were removed, the lights in the archway above the Ingalls Christmas path lit up, as everyone yelled, Merry Christmas and began to sing Christmas carols.
Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls' faces lit up in a warm glow smile. Tears of joy rolled from their cheeks. As Cole and Stanley guided Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls through the beautiful Ingalls Christmas path all the way to Critterville. Once Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls saw Critterville at the end of the path, they hugged everyone, especially the children, explaining for many years we were unable to come to Critterville and visit everyone, and at times it got lonely, and now they had their own path to Critterville. For that Christmas Eve and beyond, Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls became a big part of Critterville, and Critterville became a big part of Mr. and Mrs. Ingalls. With story time at Critterville School once a week, as Mr. Ingalls would read a great story he had written to the children of Critterville. And so it goes to prove a little imagination, little thought. You can give anybody something for Christmas. It doesn't cost nothing. It comes from here. So that's the lesson.
Yes, it is.
I hope you enjoyed the story. I know we stumbled a little bit, and it says a rough copy. So,
All right.
thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy your Christmas and all be safe out there.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.